Hey, welcome back. So here we go. All right, we are now going to page 278, 279. Setting up the government. Would you want to be president of the United States? You might be surprised to hear that George Washington did not want the job. That's my neighbor's dog barking, just in case. All right, well, let me continue. He knew that being the first president of the new country wouldn't be easy, but his countrymen wanted Washington, the first president. George Washington was the obvious choice to be the nation's first president. He was a dignified man of strong character. Better yet, he was a natural leader, which he had proved during the American Revolution. Success in the new republic was not at all assured, but Washington accepted the challenge. Even though he didn't want the job, Washington guided the new government through its early years. As the newly written Constitution directed, the Electoral College determined who would be the president in this first election, not the people. Every one of the 69 electors voted for Washington. The reluctant candidate won hands down. John Adams, who was runner-up, became vice president. So on April 23rd, 1789, thousands of cheering citizens in New York City, the country's temporary capital, welcomed Washington. He took the oath of office a week later and began his difficult task. Just in case you hear singing in the background, my mother's watching Sound of Music, and she's on the other side of the house. Oh well, let me continue. Sorry about that. Washington had to invent the role of president as he went along. My station is new, and I walk on untrodden ground, he wrote in a letter. Everything he would set a precedent or establish an example for all future presidents. Washington particularly wanted to make clear that he was president of the United States, not its king. He dressed plainly for his inauguration, so he wasn't a fancy dude at all. Okay, he dressed plainly for his inauguration. There goes my phone. Okay, the ceremony that marked the beginning of his presidency in an American-made brown suit, and he refused to be called His Excellency or Your Highness, as John Adams had suggested. After much debate, Washington decided that Mr. President would do just fine. And even since then, today, they call the President of the United States Mr. President. Or they call him POTUS, P-O-T-U-S. P for President, O for of, T for the, and U-S for the United States. So that's where you get POTUS. All right, so as I continue. A notion of difficulties. Once in office, Washington got to work. And there was a lot to do. As he himself described it, the nation faced an ocean of difficulties. The new government had to deal with problems within the country as well as conflicts in the Northwest Territory and wars across the Atlantic. To tackle all these situations, both the President and Congress had certain responsibilities and powers. As spelled out in the Constitution, essentially, Congress would make the laws, and the President would ensure they were carried out. But not everything was covered in the Constitution. Here, too, Washington set precedents. For example, he took control of treaty negotiations, bypassing Congress, and established a policy of neutrality in foreign conflicts, insisting it was within the president's power to do so. He's like, hey, I've got this covered. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and I'm the only one that's going to be able to do it, okay? Because I'm the president. I have the power to do this. Fortunately, the framers of the Constitution did not foresee the need for departments to assist the president. Congress had the power to create the departments, and the president decided who would head them. Together, the heads of the departments are called a cabinet. Yeah, like the cabinet in your kitchen. The only thing is that the cabinet is a group of people. Washington picked men from a variety of geographical areas and with a mix of political views for his cabinet. He strongly advocated political moderation and tried to keep himself as president above the bickering, arguing that went on between political factions. That way, he believed he could do whatever was best for the country. Washington appointed a group of highly talented men to his cabinet and hoped they'd put aside their political differences too. So, he decided that he's going to pick a group of people, even with different political parties. And hopefully that will work. Well, let's see what happens. Let's take a look at the caption on page 278. It's got a portrait of George Washington. The Clark Institute, Williamstown, Massachusetts. Gilbert Stuart painted 104 portraits of George Washington, including the one shown here, which was painted sometime between 1796 and 1803. John Jay, whom you may remember as the author of the Federalist Papers, introduced Washington to the painter. Stuart began creating his likeness of the president in 1795. Washington became extremely impatient sitting for his portrait, however. Even though Stuart was known as an entertaining conversationalist, Washington remained mostly silent during their sessions. Yeah, it looks like he's really thrilled to death having his painting done, his portrait done. Okay, let's go to 279. The first inaugural address. Washington wasn't required to give a speech at his inauguration, but he decided to do so. Every president since has done the same. To mark the occasion, people attending the ceremony could purchase copper buttons like the ones shown below as souvenirs. As he gave the first inaugural address, Washington was nervous. His hands and voice trembled, but his words were powerful. The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. In other words, the future of the country depended on the success of the new government, of this new government. So, still today, we follow the same rules that they had when they wrote in the Constitution. Okay? So, let's go to page 280, 281, please. U.S. Treasury Building, Washington, D.C., on page 280. In the early years of the nation, the Department of the Treasury was housed in Philadelphia. It's in Pennsylvania. When the capital moved to Washington, D.C., so did the Treasury. After 2 Treasury buildings burned down, construction on a final structure began in 1836. And this time, its architects made it fireproof. The statue of Alexander Hamilton stands before the south entrance of the building, shown here. Aha! That's the statue right up front. Okay, because he was the first he was the Secretary of Treasury when Washington was president. Okay, he was in charge of the money. Cabinet and courts. Imagine trying to play a game of soccer or basketball without any teammates. Well, I guess we can imagine that now because of the coronavirus mess we have. There's no basketball games. Okay, we can imagine. It wouldn't work. No, it doesn't work. I miss my basketball. George Washington didn't guide the new country alone either. He gathered an A-list of team members to help him. So, here he goes. Assembling a team. In the summer of 1789, Congress created the Department of State, the Treasury, and War as part of the executive branch. Washington appointed the department heads called secretaries, and they formed his cabinet. To oversee relations with other countries, Washington chose Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. As Secretary of War, former General Henry Knox would see to the country's defense. And to manage the government's money, Washington selected Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of Treasury. Now, do you understand why his statue is in front of the Treasury building? I do. Congress also created the office of Attorney General, whose primary role was to represent the United States before the Supreme Court. He would be a member of Washington's cabinet. But unlike the others, he would not head an executive department. Edmund Randolph served as the first Attorney General. The president called his cabinet secretaries together for regular meetings. However, you might be surprised to learn that Vice President John Adams was not invited to these meetings. The vice president soon realized the limitations of his position. "My country," he wrote, "has in its wisdom contrived or designed for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of a man contrived or his imagination conceived." In other words, he's saying, I'm really bored to death in my job. Vice President of the United States, it's a very boring job. There's nothing for me to do. Okay, now, the highest court in the land. So I guess John Adams was pretty much complaining. All right, so in addition to building the cabinet, Washington and Congress created a court system. The Constitution established the Supreme Court as the nation's highest court, but it left the question of how many judges would sit on the court to Congress and didn't specify what its powers would be. So in 1789, Congress passed the Federal Judiciary Act. It called for the Supreme Court to have 6 justices, 1 Chief Justice, the big boss, and 5 associate justices. Justices. Today, 8 associate justices sit on the court. The Chief Justice presides over the judicial branch of the U.S. government as well as over the Supreme Court itself. John Jay became the country's first Chief Justice. The act created the world's first dual court system, with responsibilities split between state and federal courts. Federal courts handled interstate and international cases, disputes regarding U.S. Constitution, and the civil and criminal cases related to federal laws. State courts dealt with cases involving state laws and civil disputes within the state. The act also created lower or less powerful federal courts. The federal government established executive departments and a working system of courts. But more challenges lay in store. For one thing, there was the small matter of a very large war debt to be paid. Yeah, the Revolutionary War. So this is Alexander Hamilton. He has an economic plan. So here we go. We're on 282. Can you spare a cool $54 million? The American Revolution was a success. But that's how much the Patriots had to borrow to pull it off. Now it was time to pay back the debt. The question was, how? Now they owe $54 million. How are you going to pay it back? Here we go. The price of war. In addition to America's whopping national debt, individual states collectively owed another $25 million. Foreign governments and Americans who had helped finance the war were waiting to be repaid. Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton wanted the U.S. government to demonstrate it could be trusted to take care of its financial responsibilities. Doing so would improve America's credit and encourage new business. An ardent Federalist, Hamilton suggested that the federal government assume or take over the war debts of each state. This strategy would give the government more power to run the country's financial affairs. Under Hamilton's plan, sales of federal lands in the West would finance the repayment of European loans. That means if we're going to expand. If we can expand, we can sell the lands and use that money to pay back the people from Europe that loaned us money for the war. Okay, that should work. More money would come from increased tariffs or taxes on imports and exports. Tariffs would also encourage Americans to buy American goods, which would help protect industries from foreign competition. Did you hear that? Nowadays it's the other way around. Okay? Back then it was the taxes would encourage people to buy things from the United States instead of stuff from outside of the United States. But since they lowered the tariff so much for products entering the United States from the 1980s on, that now everything was made in China. Why? Because labor was a lot cheaper over there. And to make the product, it was cheaper to have it done over there and shipped to the United States than to make it in the United States. So, they wanted everything to be made in America, but it didn't turn out that way. Alexander Hamilton must not be very happy in his grave. Okay, here we go. Hamilton suggested the government pay off the rest of its debts by levying or charging certain taxes and by issuing new bonds. James Bond. No, not James Bond. Bond. New bonds. Okay. Or investments promising interest on money loaned. So if you borrow money, okay, there are going to be certain taxes. Or, yeah, certain taxes on borrowing money. Okay. Investors would buy these bonds because the interest would produce big profits over the long run. Finally, to stabilize the nation's finances, Hamilton proposed a common currency and a national bank. This bank would collect taxes, hold government funds, and promote business and industry by issuing loans. Hamilton envisioned the United States as a strong industrial nation. Critics weigh in. Here we go. Not everyone's happy with Alexander Hamilton's plan, especially Thomas Jefferson. Here we go. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, envisioned an agricultural nation. Por ahí vienen los jibaritos. He and other anti-federalists opposed the strong central government and national bank that Hamilton envisioned. A national bank, they feared, would favor the interests of business over agriculture, specifically the interests of the industrial North over those of the agricultural South. And Southern states had even more reason to oppose Hamilton's plan. Most had already paid their war debts. Hamilton ultimately won the South's favor by promising to relocate the nation's capital to Virginia, in an area that would eventually become Washington, D.C., the current capital of the United States. Jefferson also opposed the national bank because he believed it would give the federal government unlimited powers and go against the Constitution. But since the Constitution didn't expressly forbid, that means to say no, to the creation of a national bank, Hamilton claimed the federal government had every right to establish one. Congress agreed, and in 1791 it passed a bill creating a national bank for a term of 20 years. And President Washington, who also supported Hamilton's views, signed it into law. In December of 1791, the Bank of the United States opened its doors in Philadelphia. The branches soon were established in major cities such as Boston, New York, Charleston, and Baltimore. Both Jefferson and Hamilton were dedicated to the success of the new administration and the country. However, each man often advised Washington to ignore the counsel of the other. They're like, "Oh, sir, Mr. President, please don't listen to Alexander Hamilton." That would be Jefferson. And then Alexander Hamilton would say, "Mr. President, please, ese jibarito. Thomas Jefferson, please, he's ridiculous. He's just a farmer. Don't listen to him." This made them personal adversaries or opponents. In a letter to Washington written in 1792, Jefferson claimed that Hamilton's allies in Congress were a corrupt squadron, or a military unit, whose ultimate object is to prepare the way for a change from the present Republican form of government to that of a monarchy, of which the English Constitution is the model. The very nasty and public feud that developed between Jefferson and Hamilton greatly distressed Washington. So Jefferson wrote a letter. He's like, Hamilton's in it for the money, and he and his friends are making a lot of it, and that's not right. That kind of sounds familiar. Okay, so let's look at the top of page 283, silver dollar. During the American Revolution, individual states and the Continental Congress printed their own paper money. Those notes lost value very quickly and were worth almost nothing by the end of the war. Later, when the Constitution gave Congress the sole power to issue national currency, Alexander Hamilton recommended the nation adopt a silver dollar coin. He also suggested using fractional coins to represent smaller parts of a dollar. The Coinage Act of 1792 established the United States Mint, a facility for manufacturing coins, and regulated the coinage of the United States. The act established the dollar, half dollar, quarter dollar, disme, half disme, cent, half cent as the denominations of coins. The word disme became what we know as dime, and half disme is now a nickel. The first dollar coin, called the flowing hair dollar, oh my God, from 1794, showed liberty as a woman on one side, on top, and the eagle surrounded by a wreath on the other side, the bottom. In 1790, you could have used this coin to buy a bag or two of groceries. 10 of the coins could buy you a cow. Oh my gosh. I'll give you 10 of these coins for that big cow. Okay, sounds good to me. All right, here we go. And we'll stop for now. Bye.